if you told me that in Soviet Russia they weren't required to report lab accidents, I'd be like, okay. But we're talking about the United States, where there's no regulation for that, and it's just like, hey, if you let anthrax out, could you just call the sheriff or something, or just mop the floor an extra time? That is really surprising. Are there inspections from the federal government that go in and make sure that these things are more secure, or is that also lax? Because if you don't have to report it, that makes me think that there's no oversight.
So what I've found in my reporting over the years is that this is an area, there's no sort of nuclear regulatory commission for biological research, okay? It is an incredibly fragmented area where, depending on what kind of pathogen you're working with, whether or not you receive federal funding, you may or may not have any sort of inspection. So the vast majority of biological research does not come under the kind of regulation most people think it does. It does not receive safety inspections from an independent outside entity. There is not the reporting of accidents that's required. Now, there is as I've mentioned, there's this subset of pathogens. It's several dozen pathogens that are things like anthrax, Ebola, the ones that you think of as sort of the baddest of the bugs.
Smallpox or whatever.
Smallpox, exactly. H5N1, avian influenza viruses. Those are what the government called select agents. And these select agent pathogens do come under regulations. So there is some level of inspection, and there is a mandatory requirement of incidents and accidents being reported to the regulatory agencies that oversee them. And it's jointly overseen by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Okay. So at least at the top level of the baddest of the bad, somebody's paying attention?
Yes.
Or is that an overstatement?
Somebody is paying attention. How effective that oversight is the subject of quite a bit of the book. So you have two agencies that are overseeing these labs. The reports of accidents are secret. The public can't find out about them. You can find out if your local pizzeria has had some sort of a safety violation, but you can't find out if labs working with some of the most dangerous pathogens, what happened in any reported accidents. They treat that information as protected, and it has been exempted largely from the Federal Freedom of Information Act.
That does not sound right. So I can find out if the local Chipotle had E. coli in the lettuce, but I can't find out if the neighborhood lab accidentally released Ebola to a bunch of people that work there. That's
correct.
But that's by design, right? Because they don't want people to freak out about how often they're accidentally releasing stuff to each other, to themselves.
They will say that the reason is it's a security concern. And they will say that if details about the kinds of experiments that are going on, problems in their experiments, that it will make them at risk of terrorists or somebody else. But one of the things that if you look closely at these labs, they have no problem publicizing their victories and their experiments in their glossy magazines at the universities that have these accidents with the same pathogens, that it needs to be kept secret if they've made a mistake.
I see. So if they're like breakthrough with a potential Ebola vaccine from the local neighborhood laboratory, it's like on the front page of their glossy newspaper or whatever. But if it's like, oh, and we accidentally released some of the Ebola to our employees, but don't worry, none of them died. It's like, well, actually, we can't say anything about that because security. So that's just a convenient excuse from the sound of it.
Yes, it appears to be. And in fact, Congress, they cite some legislation that passed many years ago, but the congressional intent, you can go back and take a look at it, was never to shield the accountability of these labs or the government agencies that oversee them. And coming back to your other question about, the regulation, one of the big challenges with regulation in this area is, I mentioned, it's the CDC and the U.S. Department of Agriculture that are overseeing these labs, it has both of these organizations operate their own labs as well. Their parent organizations fund the research that they're overseeing. And as I document in Pandora's Gamble, both the USDA and the CDC's labs have had some very serious safety issues, which they also have tried to keep secret from the public.
So this is probably a dumb question, but why are cover-ups so common? Is it just to keep the public from panicking?
I've been an investigative journalist for a really long time. Nobody likes their mistakes being out in the public,
Okay.
and light being shown on them.
Yeah, but it's a potentially deadly it's different than, oh man, I don't want to publicize that somebody slipped and fell on the floor of my business. I'm just going to get new flooring. I don't want people to freak out and not come. This is, oh yeah, there was some anthrax and there's a school a few blocks away. Let's just not tell anyone. The stakes are too high. It's not just a business that had, a food poisoning issue and then they had to fire the chef and replace, this is different. It's completely different. So I guess I'm incredulous and just shocked and disappointed by the fact that people have died. I assume people have died because of lab leaks in the U.S. Is that accurate? Yeah.
There have
and they're
been
just like,
over
let's
time.
not tell anyone. If you had as an attorney, I think of product liability. If you have a car tire and it shreds spontaneously on the highway and your SUV flips over, there is a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit waiting for your company. And I think that happened with Firestone or one of those tire companies a decade ago. What do I know? This is like, let's just not tell anyone. That is not an option for any other industry that I can think of.
Well, and it's I think part of the issue is that the public has not had the kind of interest in the safety of these labs until the questions started being raised about whether COVID-19 could have come from a laboratory accident. So, the public to this time has not demanded transparency of these labs in the same way that, the nuclear industry, when you have accidents like 3 Mile Island, Fukushima, and Chernobyl, those are very big and obvious events. The public demands accountability and transparency in the nuclear industry and of radiological research. The public has not, for the most part, done that in the area of microbiological research.
How easy is it to get infected in a lab? Because it sounds like, okay, if you don't wear the suit or if it's 1950 and you don't understand air pressure or whatever, fine. But now what you mentioned getting cut by an infected scalpel, they're not wearing gloves that can't be cut by those scalpels. I just find it, again, maybe I'm naive here, but I'm thinking if I'm working with anthrax or Ebola infected monkeys, I'm wearing the anti-cut gloves or the bite-proof gloves or what. I'm wearing the suit. I'm taking the shower afterwards. Maybe you just have to beat this dead horse. I don't understand how this seems to be so easily, it's such an easy mistake to make or set of mistakes to make.
Some of it has to do, what scientists have told me is that the use of safety equipment can often be cumbersome. It can reduce your dexterity. It makes it harder to do your work. If you're in one of those giant moon suits, it's slow, it's hot, it's painful, it's noisy, it's all of these kinds of things. And so there is sometimes just the human nature of, I've got a lot of stuff to do and I need to do it quickly, and corners get cut.
And I suppose there's probably, you mentioned the cavalier, like, hey, I got a new strain of Ebola, but I'm fine now, guys. I can imagine that happening at bar night with a bunch of sort of maverick scientists working on the latest bioengineering. Although it's cavalier, especially if it's something that could infect somebody else, like your kids and family. But I guess maybe, is there an element of scientists don't want safety protocols getting in the way of scientific progress? Because I can see them saying, I can either put on the suit and the gloves and do all this stuff, or I can do what I've done a million times with no incident, which is use a pipette and drop this in there, and then I can go home an hour and a half earlier. Is that what we're looking at?
That is what the research over the years of Arnold Weedham, he was very much concerned that scientists didn't want safety getting in the way of their work. And it's still a challenge to this day. And I want to be clear that, look, there are plenty of scientists who do adhere to the protocols and do follow the procedures and use the equipment and all of those things. But as you've mentioned, it is surprising how often there are those who do not. And we have gotten lucky. You asked how easy is it for scientists to become infected? We don't know how often laboratory acquired infections occur because just like with accidents, there is no mandatory universal requirement that lab acquired infections get reported to any sort of oversight body. Karen Byers, who is a researcher up in Boston, she has spent much of her career tracking at least reports in the scientific literature and elsewhere, public reports of scientists who have become infected. And from 1979 to 2015, she has been able to tally up 2,230 lab-acquired infections with 41 deaths, and that's around the world. But it's also widely acknowledged that these kinds of infections are underreported.
Look, I suppose there's an element of choosing scientists for their passion, right? Their talent for whatever they're doing and their advanced degree, and not because they're the best at safety protocols. But then and that makes sense. I understand that. But then I think, would they hire a pilot who was just like, you know what? I don't give a crap about safety. I just like flying planes. I fly them fast. I fly them low. Nobody would hire that guy ever. And yet here we are, for somebody who could kill far more people than a passenger plane full of innocent people with a or with a pathogen. And it's like, yeah, but he's the best darn gain of function guy out there. So who cares if he doesn't want to wear the suit sometimes? That's what it sounds like.
Well, and even sometimes it's not even just doesn't want to wear the suit. It may be that the suit, is not assembled properly, or they didn't take care to make sure that the suit that they're wearing is working, or that the equipment is not necessarily being maintained properly. You mentioned your background, in the law. One of the things that one expert has talked about quite a bit is, what if these labs had to obtain liability insurance against the release of pathogens? Would that sort of change the safety culture calculus in all of this?
Yeah, that's interesting. That's like the people say that with the police, right? If they had to buy their own insurance for accidentally injuring somebody on the job, this wouldn't happen every day. And maybe there's something to that, right? Maybe there's something to that idea that, like, hey, if you had to report the lab accident, maybe they'd hire a safety czar for every lab that makes sure that the suit doesn't have a hole in the back where people can't see it after they put it on, that's been there for 10 years. Because I can see people being like, I follow safety protocols, but stuff still happens. And it's like, yeah, but the armpit's been worn out in that suit for years and nobody sees it because you don't look in a mirror and raise your arms up in the air after you put on this big balloon thing. And somebody's job is that. But maybe now nobody's job is that. So I have a little bit of sympathy for not knowing that there's a pinhole in a suit or something along those lines. Thanks for watching on YouTube. Remember, you can also enjoy The Jordan Harbinger Show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Our podcast feed is a treasure trove of insights from intellectuals, authors, spies, artists, athletes, pioneers, engineers, former mafia bosses, and business leaders, all sharing their secrets to success. For more information, click the link in the description. Now, back to the show. Is there an element of, and I think you wrote about this in the book, scientists don't really want to place restrictions on other scientists, even if they're safety restrictions? I think I read something along those lines, but I don't know if I find that too convincing because it's so dumb. Right? It's so foolish that you would let the entire world come to a deadly pandemic because you didn't want to inconvenience one of your colleagues, or you thought you were too smart to follow safety protocols.
One of the debates that's going on right now, and there are some discussions about whether there should be greater oversight and some restrictions on what kinds of experiments can be done, particularly relating to gain-of-function research. The debate has all been about that only scientists and only virologists are the ones who should be allowed to be engaging in this debate because they are the experts at this, and that. And so along the lines of what you're talking about, there is this narrative that has been created that only those involved in biological research should be the ones setting the rules and overseeing themselves. And I would say that in the 15 years I've been reporting on this, perhaps the biggest challenge has been that there is not transparency and there is not sunlight, which, the old adage is sunlight is the greatest disinfectant. If the public doesn't know how often accidents are happening, if policymakers don't know how often accidents are happening because there's no transparency, there is not the incentive to be able to address the problems. And there is this idea that if you take any action in this area, it will somehow stifle science and bring the ability of these labs to bring forth life-saving treatments, if they were to have some of the same kinds of oversight that, say, the nuclear industry has.
Well, yeah, I'm thinking about like oil companies. If Chevron was like, look, we don't want to have to report oil spills. It's just going to piss people off and make them scared. We'll handle it. People would be like, no, I don't think so. I want to know when your refinery leaks into the river. I want to know when your offshore oil rig has a big-ass hole in it and it takes you 3 weeks to plug it and a gajillion gallons of crude oil spill into the area where we all fish. No thanks. I don't think you need to handle that yourself. You need some oversight. And yet with this, which seems to be equally or possibly even more deadly, we're just like, oh, okay, let's let the experts handle it. It's just such an unconvincing argument to me.
But it is resonating, I think, with some segment of the population. I mean, the mantra of trust science is now the new narrative. And if you are saying, but wait a minute, should the scientists be allowed to grade their own homework in this area? Shouldn't there be other disciplines that have a seat at the table to help evaluate risk? That is somehow seen as being anti-science.
Yeah, I think this almost seems like deliberately misleading, right? Because look, trust the science. I trust the science. It's the people involved in the science that I don't always trust. I just want them to have a couple checks and balances. That doesn't seem like an unreasonable request.